Today, how will the war in Ukraine end? Are motorists being penalised? And fancy an extra day off every week? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Theresa Villiers, Labour MP and Shadow Culture Minister Alex Davis-Jones, former Conservative advisor Salma Shah and contributing editor of Novara Media Ash Sarkar. Today, a year of war and the Russian president repeats his false claim that the West started it.
It is them who are culpable for the war, and we are using our forces to stop it.
Morning, Mr. President.
Joe Biden reaffirms his support for Ukraine. But to win, should we send fighter jets? Roadblocks, traffic calming measures and clean air zones. Are motorists being penalised? Fancy a long weekend? We'll speak to the boss who's giving her staff an extra day a week off for free.
We think that you shouldn't have both the pandemic and applause in the streets and then a massive real terms pay cut. We think the government can do better than that.
And junior doctors plan to strike for 72 hours next month, including in A&E. Let's just start the programme by showing you pictures that have just come into us from Warsaw in Poland. Here is the president. He's on a European tour. You saw in the headlines him greeting President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, when he flew into Kyiv. Somewhat surprisingly that he has undertaken this mission, if you like, with the war raging on, just as Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has addressed both houses of parliament in Russia, restating his false narrative that the West started the war in Ukraine and that Russia is only protecting itself and its people. President Biden is meeting dignitaries here. He will be meeting other European leaders about consolidating the West's response to the conflict in Ukraine. Let's just show you, or I will read the headline in the Daily Telegraph, which was Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Yesterday, she made an intervention in the House of Commons, her first, I think, since stopping being Prime Minister, heaping pressure on Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, to send fighter jets to Ukraine. Former Prime Ministers unite in call for lethal weapons to be sent to Kyiv sooner. Do we need to send those fighter jets that both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are calling for, Theresa?
I'd like it to be possible. For the moment, it seems like it's not viable. But from what I can understand, ministers are doing everything they can to meet all the asks that they've received from Ukraine, including training pilots. So in time, I hope it may well be possible to get them jets as well.
All right, so you are in favour. You're not worried about escalation, which is one of the concerns that has been put forward.
Well, that's why work has to be done to ensure that this can be done in a safe way. But I would like it to be possible for fighter jets to be supplied by the UK and its allies to Ukraine. But of course, we have to take into account those risks before a final decision can be taken on this.
Alex, what do you think in terms of fighter jets? That's what's being asked for. There are certainly plenty of military experts, as well as President Zelensky, of course, in Ukraine, who say they are needed if they're going to defeat Russia.
I actually agree with Theresa on this. I think it's vitally important that when equipment is supplied or where fighter jets are given, that the pilots have the necessary tools and expertise to fly them. It's not as simple as just giving them over. These are very technical pieces of kit, and it's important that we do train the forces in Ukraine, and we've been doing that, and we lead the way on this because that's vitally what's needed.
Right. I mean, this is about defeating Russia, Ash. And which side are you on? Would it help bring this conflict to a swifter end in favour of Ukraine, or could it risk escalation in terms of sending fighter jets?
I'm on the side of peace. And I'm on the side of a lasting and stable peace. And what worries me about some of this talk about fighter jets is that it puts Britain really out on a limb and out of step with the likes of Germany and the United States, who've been quite clear that fighter jets at this moment would be an unacceptable escalation. And one of the things that concerns me about the way in which this discussion takes place in the UK is that you've got this kind of political one-upmanship where both Labour and the Tories are going, OK, you want tanks, we'll give you tanks. You want fighter jets, we'll give you fighter jets, because they're playing to a domestic audience. Whereas actually, I think that there's some uncomfortable truths here, which is the British priority, it seems sometimes, has been to prolong the conflict because they think that in the longer term that will weaken Russia and destabilise Putin. Now, you might agree with that as a strategic goal, but there's a cost to that in civilian lives, of course, and also to Russian conscripts.
Just as we are looking at these pictures, Salwa, before I come to you, this is the arrival of President Joe Biden in Warsaw, in the Polish capital. You can see here all the dignitaries and political leaders there to welcome him. He was in Ukraine, of course, earlier and yesterday. What is your view, responding to what you've just heard there from Ash?
So I don't think it does play necessarily to a domestic audience. I think a lot of people are very worried about the instability that this war has created, not least on themselves and their pocket on energy bills. And nobody likes seeing the pictures that are coming out of the devastation that is being wreaked by the Russian army in Ukraine. I think what we have to understand is, whilst we may be an outlier as far as the US and Germany is concerned, it doesn't make us wrong. And whatever we go through in terms of the process of deciding whether fighter jets are going to be sent, it has to be about, I agree, about how we bring the war to a swift conclusion. Now, we've already seen Putin saying that, you know, there is going to be a reaction if the US acts first, and we're assuming that means the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And we can't rule out that actually we are going to have to stand with Ukraine, because this is so much deeper and it's so much more fundamental than just how this plays out. Russia has been a hostile state actor against Western liberal values for a very, very long time. We didn't say anything when he marched into Crimea. We didn't say anything when he started his actions on the eastern border. So we have to take a stand. And if we don't do it now, where is this going to lead us?
I mean, I think that there's a certain irony in hearing from the Conservative Party, well, we didn't take a stand when he marched into Crimea. You're right. In fact, the Conservative Party kept accepting Russian money.
This is not a Conservative Party view.
Well, no. I mean, I think that this is actually part of the issue I'm trying to highlight, which is this whole time, for years, we have allowed Russian oligarchs to hide their money in the City of London, to launder their money, to buy up assets. We've allowed Russian money to slosh through our politics. And now, when we're seeing the devastating consequences of that, a war of aggression by a power that clearly feels to be, you know, absolutely above international law and international norms, now we go, OK, well, what about fighter jets? What about things which risk an escalation, where the cost will be paid in civilian lives?
I mean, is there a sort of logic continuity there between allowing, yes, oligarchs to come and settle here, work here, expand here, and the aggression, military aggression from Russia?
I don't think there is a logical line to draw between those two things. I do think that there has been a naivety about thinking that opening up economic markets and creating those economic links was going to lead to more stable relations. That is certainly true. But that hostility that was coming from Moscow was going to be there whether we'd opened up our markets or not. That's not a direct correlation. But I do think that we have to understand that we are in a different game now. This is a different scenario. We tried, under the Cameron years and with George Osborne as Chancellor, to reach out to people who we thought were previously foes, ideological foes. That was true of China. That was true of Russia. That clearly has not worked. So what are we going to do now? And the answer, in my mind, is to take a stand. Now, that doesn't withstand the fact that sending fighter jets could lead to an escalation, and that decision needs to be taken very carefully. But ultimately, we need to work out what the end game is, and right now, it is not clear.
We'll leave it there. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times and talk about the Northern Ireland Brexit deal that's said to be negotiated between Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and the EU, but does not, it seems, have the support of Conservative MPs like Theresa Villiers sitting here, or the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. It says Northern Ireland Brexit deal may trigger resignations, cabinet resignations, Sunak told. Prime Minister warned not to undermine undermine Northern Ireland. Now, we were expecting an announcement this week. It may, of course, still come, but it's certainly been postponed yesterday and we probably think today. The Prime Minister was meeting Conservative MPs, including you, Theresa Villiers, yesterday. Has he reassured you?
Well, I did meet him yesterday. It was a private meeting, so I can't talk about what went on. But the Prime Minister has been very clear publicly that no agreement has been reached, but he and his team are working incredibly hard to try and secure one. And their goal is an agreement that works for the whole of the United Kingdom, including the people of Northern Ireland. And obviously, he wants to see an agreement which will deliver power sharing restored at Stormont.
So why did you go and see him?
Because I wanted to know what was happening and I wanted to put my views to him, which is that we have to deal with these very real practical problems caused by the protocol in terms of friction on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But we also have to address this problem that the protocol means Northern Ireland is subject to thousands of laws over which its people have no say and no vote.
The protocol that you and other Conservative MPs signed up to?
That's right, but it was negotiated under Article 50, and the European Union itself says that Article 50 can only ever be used for temporary transitional arrangements. It was always going to be the case that the protocol was temporary and we'd need a longer-term solution.
Is that why you signed it? Because you thought that after a certain amount of time, a fairly short amount of time, that you and your colleagues would then object and call for it to be rewritten or redrafted?
Well, the protocol itself contemplates it's going to be replaced. There was every expectation that might happen as part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It hasn't, but we're talking about political stability in Northern Ireland and the integrity of the United Kingdom as a country.
But you signed up.
To deal with
what I don't understand is you signed up to precisely that. I mean, it may have been the right thing to do, but I mean, there were endless warnings of the impossibility of squaring that circle, namely in order to avoid a customs border on the island of Ireland and maintain the integrity, as you call it, of the Good Friday Agreement, there would have to be a border somewhere, namely down the Irish Sea. You agreed to that, temporary or otherwise.
As a temporary measure, it was always vital that we have a long-term solution, and it is possible to deliver one on the basis of, for example, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which would introduce these green and red lanes and would ensure that people who are not doing business with the EU, not exporting to the EU, don't have to worry about single market rules and don't have to worry about NIP-related checks. Right.
Is the deal being negotiated, even if it hasn't been signed off, by the Prime Minister, better or worse than the protocol you signed up to?
Look, I'm not privileged to know what is going on in these negotiations.
But he must have told you in the meeting, you went to see him, he must have given you Rishi Sunak, a broad outline of what's in this deal. I mean, do you think it is better or is it worse than what we currently have?
And until I see the text of an agreement, I can't say if it's better or worse than the status quo.
All right, I put you under a little bit of pressure there. But, Salma, how much trouble is the Prime Minister in over this? Talked about cabinet resignations. Is that likely?
Well, it looks like from some of the noise that is coming out that there could be cabinet resignations. And of course, this isn't just about the technicalities of the deal. It is about the politics that is involved in this. And we have a certain former Prime Minister, in fact, two former Prime Ministers on the backbenches who've got some strong views on the protocol bill and indeed on their own ambitions to return to public office, I suspect. So this is a sort of dangerous time. And I might say that it reminds me of the last time I was in government in 2019 when Theresa May was Prime Minister and facing the exact same scenario.
Right. What advice would you give Rishi Sunak then at this point?
Don't repeat Theresa's mistakes.
And how does he do that? By not repeating them? Does he go softly with MPs like Theresa Villiers, or does he ignore the Democratic Unionist Party?
Well, he can't ignore the DUP. That's certainly true. The DUP doesn't seem to be... I mean, there are... From the quotes that are coming out from what they've seen, they don't seem to be totally satisfied, but they are not totally dissatisfied either.
Alex?
I think it's completely disgraceful that there is a lack of leadership here from the Prime Minister and he's looking to appease his backbenchers and MPs such as Theresa rather than actually developing a way forward for the people and businesses of Northern Ireland who have been left with such uncertainty for a number of years now. And if he needs political cover, then Labour have said we'll be there to support him.
Yes, Keir Starmer's been very clear about that and clearly that would be dangerous. He's been warned, Rishi Sunak, about relying on Labour support. How would you handle the Democratic Unionist Party? Because the Good Friday Agreement is based on the consent of all communities, not just a majority of members of Stormont.
It needs to be respectfully handled, I believe. You know, I represent a devolved nation myself. I'm a Welsh MP, and I do not want to see the breakup of the United Kingdom over this, and it needs to be treaded carefully. And sadly, we're not seeing that direct leadership from the Prime Minister at the moment.
Ash?
I mean, let's all be real. This has got nothing to do with the technicalities of the protocol. It is about political opportunism. Rishi Sunak is a weak Prime Minister. Everybody knows that he's nobody's first choice of prom date, all right? And you've got Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, who are keeping themselves in the public eye, trying to raise their profile. And this is a really good opportunity to play some of those songs from, you know, the Brexit impasse and to destabilise his position further. And the excuse that I don't buy here is that the Northern Ireland Protocol was always meant to be temporary. You lot stood on a manifesto and you said it was an oven-ready deal. Now, if you go, it's an oven-ready deal, but actually we're going to tinker with some of the ingredients now and take some stuff out, we have a very different definition of oven-ready.
Well, actually, I think you're completely wrong to say this is about opportunism. This is about peace and political stability in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland hasn't had a government for months. That is not good for Northern Ireland. It is undermining the Good Friday Agreement. We need to fix this.
But when you're
it is the EU who needs to move their position. They are the blockage. Not a single unionist MP or MLA supports the protocol. They all need it changed. So if we're going to restore political stability in Northern Ireland, we have to make some changes to the protocol.
You guys knew all that when you were negotiating the deal, and then both parties signed up to it, and you go, it's the EU who needs to change. Now, I'm not a business leader. I've not done many negotiations, but this seems to be a very weak hand that you've got. And when it came to the DUP, when Boris Johnson needed his so-called oven-ready Brexit deal to put to the people, essentially, he told them, you know, to go sing. There's going to be some kind of regulatory border down the Irish Sea. We don't need your support anymore. Goodbye. And you guys all signed up to it. Now you're finicking about the detail, which fine is your right, but don't claim that it's the EU's fault.
The chief vet in Northern Ireland said that if the full range of checks that the EU wanted were applied, then 50% of all the veterinary certificates issued on the EU's external border would be issued in relation to GB2NI trade. That is entirely disproportionate. We didn't sign up to the EU's entirely disproportionate implementation.
Yes, you did. You negotiated the deal and you signed it. And now you're trying to go back and take it back to the shop.
The EU is subject to international trade rules which require them to take a proportionate and evidence-based approach to any checks required before coming into their single market.
You signed up to it.
They're manifestly not doing that, Ash. They really are not.
You signed up to it.
Even with not a word of the protocol changed, the EU should be altering its position on this.
Do you think the Democratic Unionist Party will sign up to any sort of deal and be happy with it?
They've been positive about some of the progress that's been made. They were fairly emollient coming out of lengthy meetings with the Prime Minister in Belfast. But they obviously have to ensure that the Good Friday Agreement is not undermined. They have to ensure that Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom and the UK's internal market is protected.
We're going to talk about something completely different. Let me show you this headline in the Daily Mail. Tory Red Wall MP being a Conservative who's won a seat that has been traditionally Labour, Nick Fletcher hits out at international socialist concept of 15-minute cities as he condemns low-emission zones and warns traffic control measures will cost us our personal freedom. This was in a Commons debate mounting to a war on the motorist. He talked about 15-minute cities. He also talked about low-traffic neighbourhoods, which aim to reduce motor traffic in residential areas by using either cameras, planters or lockable bollards that you can see here in these pictures. The question is whether schemes like these which are there to promote walking and cycling over taking your car, do more harm than good. Do you agree with your colleague Nick Fletcher, Teresa Villiers, that this is, as he calls it, an international socialist concept that is denying people of their freedom to travel about as they please?
Well, I wouldn't use those words, but I'm worried about a number of schemes, particularly in London, but now in other places as well, which are anti-car. Now, there is a role for clean air zones. We do need to improve air quality, and charging zones have a part to play in appropriate circumstances. But we've seen traffic mayhem caused by low-traffic neighbourhoods in London, and we also see the Mayor of London wanting to extend his ultra-low emission zone to the suburbs, when his own figures say it'll have a marginal impact on air quality, and yet it will hit people with big new charges at a time of an increase in the cost of living, and therefore it's completely unjustified.
Alex?
I think they sound like a bit of a pipe dream. I think they sound like a lovely, idealistic utopia. But when you have to take a bus for 2 hours to travel a few miles, the infrastructure isn't there to support the current system, and that's what you need in place. I would love to be able to shop on my local high street, walk my children to school, do everything I need in my local community as it used to be. You know, develop that sense of community, support local businesses, to support local amenities and services. But currently, because of the lack of investment and lack of infrastructure to support these, we don't have them there.
Right, so do you think things like low traffic neighbourhoods, which are encouraging cars to have to go on fewer roads or avoiding residential areas, do you think they don't work?
I think they do work. You look at the ULEZ scheme in London, it has worked. It has significantly reduced. Yeah, it has reduced the air quality, and we are, you know, trying to prevent these preventable deaths. 4,000 Londoners a year die as a result of, you know, a contributing factor of low air quality. Something needs to be done. Something needs to be tackled. Again, we need clear leadership here. We've got City Khan taking clear leadership in London, and it needs to take firm action. But you need to have, as I said, the infrastructure in place to support it first before you develop these low traffic neighbourhoods.
Right. I mean, we can show our viewers and our guests some of the clean air zones, as they're called, aiming to cut pollution, encouraging people to drive less polluting vehicles by charging drivers of the most polluting vehicles. These are areas in the UK that have already got them, but they're going to be expanded further. You can see here with cities right across the UK too. Do you think they're a good idea?
I do think they're a good idea in principle. But of course, you are hitting the practicalities, and this is the thing with any policy or any idea that you're developing, is that as soon as you hit the reality of what people have to do in order to transition to this, it becomes problematic. And I think you can't ignore the fact that people are going to struggle who are motorists at this point in time in order to get to where you want to with these 15-minute cities. It's been trialled in Florida. This is a scheme that's been there for many, many years, decades in Florida. Paris is trying to take this up, but I don't know how successful they're going to be in terms of the traffic that comes into those cities and those areas. I think London is very different and has to be accounted for.
I mean, one of the problems is that cars are being pushed onto fewer roads, which is clogging up, to some extent, those roads, and no doubt increasing air pollution there. Is that a problem? Because you can't execute them in the way that they should be.
So you're never going to get the perfect implementation right away. And when you have seen low traffic neighbourhoods being implemented in London, so the areas that I cycle around tend to be Haringey and Hackney, you do have that period of traffic being diverted onto main roads, and you have a lot more traffic jams. And then as people start using their cars less for those non-essential journeys, turning to active travel, you reach a kind of equilibrium where you see lower traffic overall and greater uptake of things like cycling and walking buses for school journeys. The thing I'll say about the 15-minute city is, let me tell you, the babes in Paris are having a great time. They are cycling. They are having a nice time in the cafes.
But can everyone do it? Can everyone do it? Can everyone do it?
What the thing is that you have to build the infrastructure, as Alex says. If you live in a city which for so long has been dominated by the car, you get these residential islands with nary a shop to be seen. And I don't think that people prefer that they have to jump in a car and drive 10 minutes to get a carton of eggs. If you build the infrastructure, you build the services, the commercial services will come, people will be able to enjoy their neighbourhoods in a different way. I think it will have a huge role in reviving the high street, which has kind of been killed by these giant supermarkets on the edge of town. And I think that we'll end up with, you know, a win-win-win. You'll have cleaner air, healthier bodies and more lively neighbourhoods. And yeah, people use their cars less, but they can use them for the things they really need rather than being forced into it because of underinvestment.
Salma?
I don't think they will need their cars less, because the problem that you're faced with at the moment is that people don't necessarily work close to where they live. And the problem with 15-minute cities, whilst I totally agree with that concept, and like the idea that's what we're progressing towards, is that actually the infrastructure that you're going to depend on, like the transport infrastructure, is failing, and it's not working well in London at the moment. And so if you're going to do that, kind of, you know, you still need to work out how you're going to get people to live closer to where they work to. And pricing for 15-minute cities wouldn't help that, because you'd price a lot of people out of the market. to be closer to these kind of like lovely amenities and areas that are essentially walkable.
Right, and Teresa, you've actually signed a letter to the Conservative Party Chairman Greg Hands asking him to support a bill which would give London councils, I mean, these are obviously across the country, but London councils the ability to block plans by the Mayor of London that you said, Alex, Sadiq Khan, to expand the low emission zone in London. Why?
Because I believe the borough should have a say in this. I think it's particularly important to remember that what might possibly be workable and deliverable for inner London with a hugely extensive public transport system doesn't necessarily work or isn't necessarily tolerable for suburban areas outside that zone, or indeed for cities across the rest of the country. What happens is not that people all suddenly switch to taking a bus, it's that they face punitive costs of buying new vehicles or paying £12.50 a day.
This is the problem with politics in this country, is when you come up with an idea, what you end up hearing from the people in power is, no, better things aren't possible. Well, actually, you could invest in public transportation if that's what your government wanted to do.
We just put £5 billion
invest in healthy and active travel. You could invest in suburban areas so that people don't have to drive 10 minutes to go get a pint of milk or whatever it is. But actually, when you're faced with a plan where you go, OK, there's going to be some challenges getting there, but it's worth pursuing.
Come and talk to my constituents.
I grew up right next door to Barnet.
There are businesses that are going to go under because of this. It'll turn our town centres into ghost town. It'll mean that our public services, already struggling to get the workers they need, will struggle even more because so many people live outside of London and drive in.
Into ghost towns because of the big Tesco's or the big Sainsbury's or the big Lidl or whatever it is. That's what's been killing the high street all this time. Like that's the truth.
The high street is guaranteed to be killed dead if these vigorously anti-car measures start to proliferate around the country.
I mean, what if you can't cycle? And what if you can't walk very far? And as you said, the bus journey takes 2 hours. Aren't these measures unfairly penalising motorists and car drivers?
I think they're unfairly penalising anybody who's unable to currently use those public services that they need to access them. Like you said, we need proper investment in our infrastructure at the moment. We haven't had it. This phrase levelling up keeps being bandied about, and it doesn't actually mean anything if you're not going to invest and create that thing. What we've been discussing is incredibly London-centric at the moment. You come to a seat like mine in South Wales, and of course there's an over-reliance on cars because of the nature, the topography of the seat. But what we need is clear direction and a firm sort of direction of where we're going to go in infrastructure. You've got the Welsh Government looking at developing a South Wales metro, which would make it easier for people to get out of their cars, which would invest in a bus and tram system, linking all of this together, which would reinvigorate the high street. Trying something new, taking the initiative to tackle some of the problems that we're facing, because, as Ash said, we're not going to do anything if there isn't a lack of clear direction and a policy to make lives better for people and to reinvigorate the high street.
Well, let's talk about a 4-day working week. A 6-month trial of working 4 days a week instead of the traditional 5 has ended, with many companies deciding to stick to that pattern. 61 companies took part. 56 say they will continue with the 4-day week. Here's the headline in BBC News: firms stick to 4-day week after trial ends. Let's talk to Carly Goodman-Smith, who's Operations Director at Tyler Grange. And Tyler Grange, an environmental consultancy, trialled it and is going to stick with it. Tell us about the experience of the 4-day working week for you.
It's been fantastic, to be honest. We did a lot of planning ahead, but we did bring it forward in order to align with the UK's pilot programme. We had originally planned to do it in January, so it was a bit of a sort of suck it and see sort of situation, but it's been overwhelmingly positive and seeing huge benefits to the business. Levels of sickness and absenteeism is down. Our productivity has actually improved since going on to 4 instead of 5 days. And everyone is sort of happy and healthy and raring to go on a Monday morning because they're well rested from a 3-day weekend.
And when you say productivity has improved, in productivity for the company as a whole, or individual productivity has improved as well, even though people are working 4 days, so 80% presumably of the hours, and being paid the same?
That's right. So the concept is 100% pay for 80% of your time with a view to maintaining 100% of productivity. And we've been measuring it across the business, and our productivity has actually gone up to equivalent of 102%. So with only 80% of our working hours. So across the business, we have seen increased productivity. It really does focus the mind when you've got 4 days to deliver your workload instead of 5.
Yeah.
And like I say, we've had reduced absenteeism and brought in measures to improve efficiencies in the business.
How many employees are there, Carly?
We've got about 85 to 90 at the moment. We're quite a seasonal business, so it kind of flexes in the summer months, but yeah, at the moment around 85.
Well, Carly, we're going to just show this picture of your happy co-workers demonstrating some of the things they've been able to do on their 5th day. Salma, what's not to like?
No, it sounds brilliant, and I'm sure everybody would want to take advantage of that extra day to be able to do other things like hobbies and jobs and the odd jobs. I know I'm never out of errands to do, especially at the weekend. I think it's really interesting that this has come post-pandemic, because I don't think it would have been as readily accepted if people hadn't already started thinking about flexibility. The only thing that sort of is a caution in my mind is that, you know, I work a 5-day week, but it often seeps into the evenings and it often goes into weekends. So it's just like how much of that is going to be really strictly adhered to in the 4 days, especially if you're on email, especially if you're kind of like just doing a little job here and there. And I do worry that, you know, that necessarily isn't captured, where that extra day, whether it's a Monday or a Friday, where little bits of work are actually done, is not really there in the numbers.
Well, let me get Carly to respond to that. What happened in your experience in what Salma has just described?
We were quite strict initially and said that we really didn't want anyone to be doing anything on a Friday because we wanted to see if it worked. There does have to be some flexibility sometimes. So if a client specifically asks for a meeting on a Friday and there's absolutely no way of changing it, then we will need to shift things around to be able to accommodate that. And I would never want to add pressure to our employees as part of needing to deliver in 4 days instead of 5. But overwhelmingly, like I said, we have seen that productivity of individuals and the ways that they work has massively improved. So if everyone is on the same mindset of, you hear banded around quite a lot, oh, that wasn't a very 4-day week meeting if it goes on a little bit too long. So if everyone is working in the same mindset, then you get less of that seeping into free time. And I think it's about quality time as well. So our employees aren't just doing kind of life admin stuff, although that's so helpful to be able to do that on a Friday when the kids are at school, and so it doesn't affect your weekend. But we're also doing, loads of people are really investing in their communities, so doing volunteering on a Friday, as well as, you know, their own self-care. So being more available to family and friends, taking up hobbies, and just generally kind of improving their own well-being, so that when they're at work, they're working better.
Would it work in every sector, Ash? I mean, 80 to 90 employees is a reasonable number of people to accommodate in a 4-day week. But could it work everywhere? Could it work in big public sector organisations in the same way?
Well, we'd have to see, of course, but there was a report that came out by a think tank called Autonomy, I believe it was about 2 or 3 years ago, which modelled what would happen if you went to a 4-day week without a loss of pay in the public sector. And one of the things that they said is that, yes, you would have increases in productivity in some areas, but in others you would actually have job creation, much needed job creation, particularly in Red Wall and Welsh Seeds. So I think that it's not going to have the exact same impact absolutely everywhere.
No.
But when you do need to bring in more staff, that is actually something which could be quite helpful, particularly when you look at geographic inequalities in this country. And one thing that I'd say is that Novara Media is a 4-day week employer. It's been working really well for us, because one of the things that we found before we became 4-day week within our contracts, and people were just sort of, you know, working really as much as they could, is that we were really suffering from burnout, really suffering from burnout. And so what we did was we prioritised the longevity of our organisation. We're not just going to burn through staff and then make a new hire. We're going to look after people. And the goal is that you're with us in 5-10 years and you've grown with the organisation, rather than us just sort of driving you to the point of a nervous breakdown, be like, right, get us the next graduate.
Where are you signing here to do this 4-day week, Teresa? I mean, is this something you would support and the government should take on and perhaps legislate for?
No, is the answer to that. I mean, if you're a business who feels you want to give your staff the same pay for a shorter week, that's absolutely fine. If it works for Carly and her colleagues, that's great. But I don't see it as practical as a universal model, not least because we need to get our productivity rates up as a country, and I'm not convinced this would do this.
You don't, even though Carly is saying the productivity there has gone up, obviously that's one example.
Yes, it's one study, and also, you know, you'd have to look at the very long-term impacts of this. What might work in the short term won't necessarily work in the long term, but how could the NHS possibly accommodate the massive increase in salary bill of giving all its current staff the same pay for 4 days a week? It would severely hamper the ability to meet this rising healthcare need and clear the COVID backlog if we were to do this.
Look,
but would you not lose less staff? I mean, staff retention, excuse me, surely would be improved. So there wouldn't be this constant turnover of staff. And so you could deliver the amount of care by making sure that the staff within the NHS are well looked after and are happy and healthy to go to work instead of burning out.
We need to do more on staff retention. I completely agree with that. But I just think the massive, massive cost of a 4-day week for the public sector, it wouldn't deliver the productivity or the staff retention benefits sufficient to enable us to meet those costs at a time when, you know, the government's already struggling with the impacts of the Ukraine war on the public finances.
Would you want to pilot it?
This just isn't affordable.
Would you want to pilot it? Would you want to see more pilots? Because if you're saying, oh, OK, we need more long-term data and we don't know how it's going to work in these other sectors, would you want to see pilots in those sectors?
Certainly, if private companies want to undertake these kinds of projects, I don't see the need to do in the public sector. I know the Labour government in Wales wants to do this, but I have severe concerns for how that would impact on our public services at a time when affordability is always a pressure. And remember, this massive increase in salary bill that you're advocating for the public sector, it would reduce the amount we could spend on frontline services.
Alex?
And that would be
I mean, is that a risk in Wales, then, if you're going to take this on?
We're going to obviously, the Welsh Government are keen to trial it. We're doing a universal basic income pilot as well at the moment in Wales. We are trying new things to try and look at how we can better retain our staff, boost productivity and make us a happier and healthier workforce. That's what we want. But ultimately, this isn't just about length of time in work. We need to look at things like pay and conditions. I have been in that chamber in the House of Commons when 20 times an employment bill was promised by this Conservative government and it's yet to be delivered. We need to have a new way forward. Labour have got a new plan for working people that covers all of these bases, ending fire and rehire, looking at statutory sick pay, making flexible working better, increasing maternity leave, looking at paternity leave, figuring out what is the barriers to people getting into work and how can we make working life work for everybody.
Carly, thank you very much for joining us today. Talking of the health service and pay for NHS staff, this headline in the Financial Times: junior doctors in England vote to strike as NHS pay dispute escalates. Let's talk to a junior doctor, Dr. Anna Warrington. She's in East London. Anna, why are you supporting the strike action?
So I'm supporting the strike action because I think that pay restoration is fair for junior doctors.
What does that mean, pay restoration?
So over the past 10 years, junior doctors' pay has been cut in real terms by 25%. Junior doctors are feeling this in a very real way in the current financial context. And it is time that we have our very high set of skills and our very high risk role recognised by being paid exactly what we were paid before pay cuts came in.
Right, so we're talking about 30% rise, around that.
It's shocking, isn't it, when you hear that successive governments have given junior doctors a 25% pay cut. Doesn't that surprise you? I'm sure they haven't had a 25% pay cut in the same time.
Teresa?
Look, obviously, I would want all public sectors to be paid more in an ideal world, and the junior doctors have had a multi-year settlement which delivers a significant pay increase. But, you know, the trouble is that inflation matching pay rises across the board in the public sector
would be way beyond inflation, obviously.
Could potentially fuel inflation, and that erodes wages and makes all of us poorer, and also leaves less to be spent on frontline services.
Anna?
Well, there are just so many things to consider in that statement, isn't there? You know, if You can manipulate junior doctors' pay to reduce inflation. Fantastic globally, not so good for the rest of the nation who needs a working healthcare service. We need junior doctors on the front line, and there are fewer and fewer of us. And why, we ask ourselves, could it be that we're being paid 25% less than before, and it's harder for us to go to work for that salary when we could get a much better paid job outside of the health service altogether? And I don't mean in private healthcare, where of course we would be paid better. I mean in almost any other high skilled job, like for example working for pharmaceutical companies or even working in another country. It doesn't make sense for us to stay in our roles for as little pay as is now being offered. And it is a shame that the financial position of this country has been damaged to the extent that it has, so that the health service is grossly damaged as a result.
All right.
But I don't think junior doctors should be made to bear the brunt of that cost.
Teresa?
Nor the patients.
I can only reiterate, of course, I want to see junior doctors' pay go up. And it is going up under the multi-year settlement, but I hope more that can be done in the future. But I honestly feel that this strike action is not the best way forward, given the backlog that the NHS faces. And I hope junior doctors may consider calling off their action.
Do you support the strike action? Oh, just one moment, and I will come back to you. Do you support the strike action, Alex?
Strike action is always a last resort. Nobody wants to be going on strike.
But do you support this strike action? You've listened to what Anna has said. Do you support her?
I support Anna's right to strike. If she feels
not
that
the right to strike,
doctors...
but do you support the strike action on the basis that she set out?
I support Anna's right to strike. She is a junior doctor struggling on the front line. We cannot clap for our public sector workers and our frontline staff and then threaten to sack them.
So you'd give them a 30% pay rise if you were in government?
I'd encourage the Prime Minister to get around the negotiating table and actually get in the room, because he's not at the moment. He's refusing to even get at the table to negotiate on this situation. I'm not going to sit here and develop a manifesto or look at the finances when we haven't been given them. But what the Prime Minister knows, the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary are able to get around this table, and I'd urge them to do so, because, as you said, this is the last thing the NHS needs, but it's the last thing that junior doctors
But would you give them any pay rise? Would you say to Anna, look, we'll get round the table. I think the settlement is something like 2% a year over 4 years, so just over 8%, nothing close to 30% or 25%. Would you give them a pay rise in the region of 10%?
I don't know the figures. I haven't had them.
Well, 10% around inflation rate. Would you at least consider that if you were in government?
I would be around. If I was in government, I would be at the table negotiating with the trade unions, trying to develop a way forward, not just ignoring them and preventing the strike action from prolonging.
What would you do, Salma, in this situation? I mean, you've heard what Anna has set out. Junior doctors going on strike, including A&E. People will be worried about it.
People will be very worried about it. And also, you know, it is always about that service provision. And, you know, it's hard not to have sympathy, because as the details have been set out, you know, there has been stagnation in wages for a long time in the public sector. And that hasn't been as sharp because interest rates have remained so low. And now we are in a different context. And I think the only way that the government can really get around the negotiating table and talk to junior doctors and nurses is being honest and clear about the trade-offs that come with this. I mean, you know, in terms of the figures, we've had a budget. We know that the public finances are in a parlous state. However, there are two things that could be helpful in this scenario. One, we don't think that recession is going to be as long as was first predicted, and hopefully there will be more money left after the energy bill, the cap on energy bills have come through. But I do think that there needs to be some honesty about the trade-offs.
Anna, thank you very much for joining us today. Ash, your comments on the strike action that is going ahead now and what can actually be done.
So 4 in 10 junior doctors say they're considering quitting as soon as they can find a new job. The current state of affairs is not sustainable. The NHS is on its knees, and when you want to look at what a day-to-day experience in the NHS is when it isn't on strike, you've got people waiting over an hour and a half, 2 hours for category 2 calls.
Is a 30% pay rise sustainable?
Well, I think cutting 25% wasn't. And what you're going to have to do is start looking at inflation matching pay rises. And the reason why I don't buy this idea that if you give doctors and nurses a pay rise, which means that you can keep them in the NHS, that you're going to fuel a wage price spiral, is that already you've got pay wins in the private sector way above what's going on in the public sector. So what economists are saying is that, yes, there would be a risk of a wage price spiral if you have pay increases over and above the private sector. That's not what's happening. Paid doctors and nurses, I don't want to be scared of breaking my leg. Job done.
On that note, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live and PMQs, of course, 11:15.